With that, we're going to get the day 2 plenary started. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Colin Camerer, the Robert Kirby Professor of Behavioral Economics at the California Institute of Technology. He's the director of the T&C Chen Center for Social and Decision Neuroscience Leadership, and also holds a chair in that center's name. He was recognized as a MacArthur Fellow in 2013, and he's done pioneering work in experimental behavioral economics, behavioral game theory, neuroeconomics, and most recently, replication of randomized controlled trials in economics. And I think we mentioned his work yesterday, and he's going to share with us some of what he's studying in this realm. So Colin, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in Melbourne, which I hope to visit soon with my family. I've heard it's such an outstanding place and I love that your group is formed and doing so many interesting things. So I'm going to give a sort of somewhat indulgent old person talk about how I got interested in reproducibility and what have you. I don't like to read the idea of reproducibility crisis because it sort of forces you to have a reckoning of like, when is the crisis over? And like it's like the NBR trying to decide when's the recession start, when's the recession over. So I think of it as more like reformation or reboot. Like we're just doing a lot of things we should have been doing all along, some of which are easier now or feasible because of technology. And I just want to I'm optimistic, so I'd like to use a positive spin. Okay, so here's how I got interested in this. I like trouble, as Kathy knows, and she does too. And in 2014, if you study neuroeconomics, you may get to go to Sicily. Thank you, Camilo Parioschioppa, for a neuroeconomics meeting. If you were there, you might have met Anna Draber, who's a talented economist, behavioral economist, experimental person in Sweden. And she and Magnus Johansson and lots of others. I apologize for not mentioning everybody's names, but most of these projects have a huge number of people with them, and they're listed typically in the paper authors lists, but I'm just not going to be able to get them all on the screen. Anyway, and so Anna and others had in 2015 published a paper in PNAS where they had prediction markets where people could buy and sell essentially an artificial share, which would pay money if a paper replicated, and it would not pay money if a paper didn't replicate. And so you can interpret that with some nuance. The prices of those shares are like a measure of the aggregate crowdsourced probability of a replication occurring. These prediction markets have been used a lot. They're very, very accurate. If you like the Academy Awards or something like that, do not look at the prediction markets the night before because almost all of the major awards are highly predictable. And they were, I won't have time to unpack this, but they were kind of invented at Caltech originally by papers inspired by studies done by Charlie Pott on information aggregation. That is, could a single market price kind of add up the information from people trading in the market? Okay, anyway, so Anna had done these prediction markets based on an early Many Labs paper in psychology from Brian Nosek and others in that big group. And so she said, oh, we're thinking about doing our own replication project on experimental economics, which is something that's very important to Caltech. Caltech was a major incubator in this enterprise starting in the 70s, very early on. And experimental economists have a little bit of a holier than thou attitude compared to other experimental social sciences. We are really fussy about deception and pay people money and having very clear instructions. And so we thought this was interesting because there was sort of a view in experimental economics that, of course, everything will replicate nicely. And we wanted to find out if that's true. So we recruited this large international team, and partly to cover languages, because quite a few experiments in economics are done in Europe, less so in Asia, mostly in English-speaking countries. There was a lot of conference calls spanning large numbers of time zones, which meant I had to stay up late, which is easy, or get up early, not easy. I should add that this was very rapidly funded by Sloan Foundation and later by Wallenberg and Hedelius Foundation very generously in Sweden, and also Austrian Science Fund. Jorgen Huber and Michael Kirchler there. And so literally, I think I met Anna in the fall, and in January 2015, I ran into Danny Goroff, who's a program officer at Sloan Foundation, and he said, are you doing any interesting things? And I said, yeah, we're gearing up this big replication thing, but we don't really have any money, but I'm hoping we can get some. It won't be that expensive. And we're not going to charge you for principal investigator time, et cetera, et cetera. It's just really to hire some students to run things and then pay the subjects. And he was like, oh, send me a proposal immediately. I would love to fund that. I would love to fund that. So money was like stacked up. And similarly with Arnold Foundation was very generous in funding open science framework. Funding agencies seem to have the viewpoint, again, not every funding agency, but you don't need every funding agency, you just need some, and generous ones, that if people are willing to do the work, we will pay for it. So that's great. When we had gotten started, I got an email from an editor of science saying, hey, I heard you're working on this thing. Have you decided where to send it? That's about the best email you can get in science. And then later I did some work on meta-analysis, which I won't talk about today unless you're really eager to know in the Q&A. And 2 of those papers have come out. So let me just highlight what I think are positive things, and then I'll turn to just some data, and I'm just going to speculate a little bit about institutions and what people can be doing. And I think a lot of your talks and roundtables, from what I can tell from the descriptions, are just right on the frontier of all these things. So one is that almost from thin air, there've been development of a bunch of what you might call medium scale institutions. Medium scale meaning they're not government run. There's not $100 million. One is Open Science, about Abel Brodeur in Canada, I think, has something called Institute for Replicability. He has also worked on a bunch of empirical papers looking at like distributions of T statistics in published data, and you see what looks like a kind of p-hacking, or it's either p-hacking by authors or it's publication bias instigated by the refereeing process. I've come to think it's much more like that than authors, but it may depend a lot on the field and on norms, obviously. AIMOS is another one, and I think we'll see some more. There's been a pretty positive rise of registered reports, particularly in psychology. In economics, the main one I know about is Journal of Development Economics. Registered reports, for maybe the few of you who don't know, are essentially you send in a paper without the data and say, here's what we're going to collect, here's how we're going to analyze it. And if we get a positive coefficient in a regression, we're going to make this conclusion. If we get a 0 coefficient, we're going to make this conclusion. And then the paper is accepted pre-collection of the data. It's in a way, it's not that radical. It's sort of like when you fund a grant proposal, right? You say, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of money, and then go get the data, and we'll see what happens. Here, you don't have to give anybody money. You just have to say, you have to give them a spot in the journal and say, I'm interested in your results, whatever they may be, rather than, I want to wait and see what the results are, and then I get to decide for myself, which scientifically it seems to be hard to defend that. I would say replicability is somewhat predictable, which is interesting to know, although I noticed a talk title very intriguing by Patrick Vu at your meeting. I'll talk about prediction markets and a little bit about machine learning next. Okay, this is a paper of ours that's probably not quite as well known, or certainly not as well cited, by Altmaier. This was a spinoff of the project with Anna Draber. The first one came out in Science. That was about experimental economics. A second one came out in Nature Human Behavior. That was replicating papers social science papers that had been published in Science and Nature. And this is just a graph of a whole bunch of stuff. So each of these is a study that has an original effect size, right? Like 1 is 1 standard deviation, Cohen's d typically, or maybe translated to a correlation coefficient, and a replication effect size. And these are what I would like to call intended replications, meaning the entire goal was to hold so many things fixed that if there was a genuine result, you should get something like the same result. There's always some slippage about instructions, subject pool, sometimes elements of culture. And so you don't necessarily expect perfect replication, but as you can see, this is from 4 data sets. EE is experimental economics and so on, and the MLs are many labs. And the replication effect sizes are about half as big as the original effect size. The bold line here is the 45-degree line. So if things are replicating perfectly with sampling error, it would be above and below. And then the triangle of replicated, not replicated is just a draconian, mapping into two categories based on, kind of old-fashioned frequency statistics. Okay, and a big chunk of the studies, you basically have zero replication effects. Sometimes the effects turn negative. So in this sample, I think it's something like 30 or 40% replicate pretty well. Those are triangles and the rest don't. Okay, so in this paper with Altamade et al., what we wanted to do was to see if we could train pretty simple machine learning classifiers. We don't really have a lot of data, right? Because we only have on the order of 50 or 100 data points, which are replications, which generates a number like an effect size or a replicate yes, no, and then original effect sizes and features of those papers. So this is kind of baby machine learning. Someday maybe we'll have hundreds or thousands of these. And so the first thing to note is that the predictors of replication, which are shown here on the right, I'll get into more detail. The model correlation between predicted effect size and actual effect size is about 0.36. We also developed this on 3 data sets, and then we pre-registered and then held out. We basically started doing it while we were waiting for the Science and Nature replication sample to come in, and then we kind of froze the predictors from the first 3 data sets and then just used it to forecast the Science Nature sample. And there the correlation is a little lower, 0.25. And in addition, we compared this machine learning model, I'll give you more detail in a minute, with prediction markets. So these are people trading again in these markets where you can trade from 0 to 1, whether either the probability that something will replicate by some very clear, simple criterion like p less than 0.05, or there's also markets for relative effect sizes. So you could come along later, which could basically bet on the size of the relative effect in the replication relative to the original in kind of bins, numerical bins. And in this case, the cross-validated model in the original data is 72% accuracy. That's an area under the curve, where 50 is roughly the benchmark of random and 100 is perfect. Markets are around 66%. So it looks like either these models or an implicit model that's being expressed by market prices are generating, somewhere between random and perfect predictability. Certainly, well above 50%, but there's room for improvement, and that is almost inevitably will come if we have more data, because that's how machine learning works. More data. If you're disciplined about it and correct for overfitting, more data will always help you. Okay, let me walk through what's on the right-hand side. So we basically tried to predict 2 things, which is, did a paper replicate or not 0.1 with this p less than 0.05 standard? Again, I know that's very crude, but that's often of some interest and it's easy to summarize. And we also try to predict the relative effect size, which was the new effect size from the replication divided by the original. Okay, and again, those are often around 0.5. And first, let me talk about the bars. So what these right-hand side bars show is what are sometimes called importance weights, which means the effect size is used random forest. Actually, we tried a whole bunch of different things, like mostly random forest. I don't have time to explain different machine learning techniques. Random forest is a really nice, robust one. It's kind of easy to interpret. And it basically just looks for like a tree structure that says, well, if the p-value is a certain level, then, and the replication sample size is a certain number, then it goes through these kind of series of classifications, and then it will predict either replicate, not replicate, or will predict a numerical effect size at the bottom of the tree. And so the size of the bars means the percentage. The random forest, it's called a forest because you get a tree and then you aggregate a bunch of trees. And so this percentage is the percentage of trees in which that variable turns out to be significant when controlling for overfitting by making sure the trees aren't too deep, and a few tricks like that. Very standard conventions that have emerged over the years. Okay, so long bars, like at the top, mean that in a lot of trees that then get aggregated into the forest, that variable was included. So post hoc power. So that O means original study, R means the replication. So post hoc power means we go back and say, given the effect size they found, what was the degree of power, the likelihood given their sample size to actually detect that. And so you can see that shows up a lot. P-value in the original study, very, very simple and by far the strongest. The effect size. So as you go down the tree, you're getting variables that are less and less frequently in the random forest. And again, there's two different models for 0-1 replication and then a linear model for relative effect size. So there's some differences as you go down, like sample size is very important for relative effect size at the second bottom row, but not so much for predicting 0-1 replication. And by the way, this is only the first half of the table. There's another bunch of variables that are in our original paper, but I chopped off here so you could see a few things. Okay, what these numbers in the boxes are is after you select a variable with the lasso and random forest in order to minimize the number of variables selected so we don't overfit, we then go back and rerun the lasso and say, well, what's the coefficient value? And these are all standardized. So they're in terms of number of standard deviations. And by far the biggest one is p-value. Actually, I think these are standardized. I might be wrong about that. So don't fuss too much about the size of the coefficients. If the original paper has a weak p-value, it's much less likely to replicate. It's the simplest thing in the world. Post hoc power has a small effect. Another pretty substantial effect is social psychology. Let me say a bit about that. But here's what I have to say about that, which is social psychology does not replicate as well in general. That's what this discipline dummy is telling you. Cognitive psych, no problem. It does show up with a lot of importance, but the coefficient doesn't enter in lasso when you run the lasso. Discipline of economics is a little bit better, but a lot of the discipline social psych is if you drop the discipline variable out and you include interactions, most of this social psych penalty is due to interaction effects. So in experimental economics, it's pretty unusual that you say, we want to see if the length of a prisoner's dilemma game affects cooperation for women, but not men. That would be an interaction, right? A dependent variable which would interact with a treatment or a characteristics variable. In psychology, these interactions are extremely common, right? So a lot of the degradation of replicability we think has to do with interactions. And this is something we had a long discussion with Brian Nozick, who worked on the Nature Human Behavior project with us. And he and I think this is really the key thing, which is if you're hunting for interactions, you need a lot of power to find them. It helps a lot if they're a priori theorized rather than, oh, it turns out that, people with low BMI are different than people with high BMI. There's a lot of danger in ex post theorizing or post hoc theorizing. Anyway, so a lot of this social psych penalty seems to have to do with the fact that interactions are often the thing that people are most interested in. In economics, we're usually just trying to understand main effects about which there's sometimes controversy, or the size of the main effect. We want to know if it's small or large. Okay, there's a tiny effective number of authors. I don't know what that means. Again, that some of these are collinear with practices in different fields, like more authors in social psych. Ratio of male authors strangely enters positively, which means the male authored papers are likely to replicate more. Like, I don't know if that's genuine or it's just, it could be associated with some other omitted variable. And last thing I'll mention is compensation. If this is something economists are obsessed with, if you paid the subjects according to their performance, then that seems to, if you did not, if the compensation level in the original study is nothing, there's no compensation, then that seems to harm replicability. So we really believe in compensation in experimental economics and in neuroeconomics also, that we kind of like convince them to do the same. If you're paying $500 an hour for fMRI, why not, toss $20 to the subject, based on what gambles they choose or how they thought through a game theoretic game. And so this is like, purchasing replicability. So I don't want to get into a big McGill about this, but it is something experimental economists think very strongly about. I've been on both sides of this debate because if you can't afford it, I think you can learn something from data where you don't pay people extra money, because they have intrinsic motivation and what have you. Anyway, so this compensation variable is important. And then there's another quirky variable is seniority of researcher. That's negative. So more senior researchers seem to not replicate as well. Maybe people are resting on their laurels. Who knows? Okay. All right. Let me turn to another topic I've been thinking about recently, which is called technical debt. So if you don't know what this, first of all, I maybe not be describing this super accurately, so I would not at all mind if you correct me in the discussion or in the chat if I am not using this correctly. So technical debt is a term used in kind of IT for when a system is like a user interface, for example, or remote control from a TV is not really well designed to anticipate needs for future functionality, right? So for example, in our institutional review board, where we have to type in our documents for ethics review, the save button, it doesn't auto save. And the save button is like a tiny little button, like way off on the right side where you would never look for it. Right. So whoever designed this, in fact, I know who it is. It's somebody named Steve, right? Who was my arch enemy. Steve does not understand human visual salience, apparently, because you would want to put the save button somewhere like obvious and make it pretty big. And so every single person who's used this IRB, which is me and various postdocs, they always end up, it's like, I thought I filled that out already. I said, did you press save? No, I thought it auto saved. It doesn't auto save. And Steve made it hard to see where Steve is. That's technical debt, Steve. And I think quite a bit, I mean, kind of harping on this because some of the things we can see, this is like easy fixes. The reason they're easy fixes, they need to be fixed at all, is that they weren't built in the first place. So I think science has quite a lot of pockets of like technical debt, which often make open science frustrating and costly, like the way a website is built to make it easy. For example, pre-registration, right? So Open Science Framework makes it easy to pre-register. They did a good job, not much technical debt there in my judgment. And or Simonson and others have another site called As Predicted or something like that. Then the idea is to make it easy to pre-register. Because otherwise, a famous experimental economist from Stanford might get up in a big audience a couple of years ago, as she or he did, and say, it's so costly to pre-register. It's so hard. It's so costly. Oh, I can't do it. I don't have grad students at Fancy Pants Stanford who can help me. It's not costly. It's just not, because there's not.
Hi, everyone who's online. As you've probably worked out, Colin's just having some technical difficulties. So as soon as he's back, we'll get going.
My arch enemy, Steve. Yes. So Steve created technical debt, which I'm mad about. Let me just give you a quick example. The technical debt's going to be the least of our worries, I think, moving ahead. But it's just something that when I first heard of this concept, I thought, oh, this makes a lot of sense. And it's something that I think founders and people who want to develop a framework like Open Science Framework, the Open Science Framework, I think, did a great job of not incurring technical debt. They thought through, like, how do we make this thing easy to use? It has good backup, and avoiding technical debt costs money and vision. Here's a quick example. So Reinhard Zelton, a later Nobel laureate, and Torsten Chimera published this influential paper in the American Economic Review that has now a 5% acceptance rate, very big deal. And it turned out that we looked at the paper and said, I think there's some mistakes in it. There were some mistakes in it. What you see on the right is essentially estimates for 12 different games that they ran, game theory experiments. And they studied 5 different theories, Nash, QRE, et cetera. The right-hand side is the observed average, which is the data. And all you need to see from this is the bold numbers are numbers that they computed incorrectly in their paper. And the regular numbers are numbers that they computed correctly. So about half of the numbers, 40% of numbers were wrong. just wrong. And so we wrote a comment about this and we pointed out what was going on. You can see the original paper came out June 2008. I think our paper was in December 2011, 3 years later. We begged the editor and we said, look, this paper is full of mistakes. If it was a newspaper, you would print in the next day's newspaper or online 32 minutes later that there's a correction. And it shouldn't take the New York Times 30 minutes or 1 day, and it takes the AER 3 years. Anyway, that argument fell on deaf ears, and the technical debt's coming up in a second. So it like big deal. So, you know, after our correction was printed, you know, maybe then the literature accumulated regularity and this absorbed it. And so hopefully after our correction by Brunner et al. Was published in 2011, whenever people cited Zelton and Chimura, they also cited the correction, right? It's like, that's how it would work in newspaper land or for magazines. Incorrect. So this is a citation counts from Google Scholar for the original paper in 2008. You can see, for example, in 2014, there's 22 citations. Our publication, our correction rather, was published in 2011. So you can kind of forgive the people in 2010. And I'm going to show you the publication, the Google Scholar citation rates for our correction. And we're going to see when they catch up. How well do they catch up from 2011 to 2022 in terms of the citations to the original paper? And the answer is they don't catch up at all. Basically, this is 2 to 1. There's 5 citations in the first 3 years. And then the 8 years after that, there's only 2. So most of these people citing this paper from 2014 on are citing a paper full of mistakes that they don't know about and that their readers are not knowing about. So there's hundreds of citations that are mistakes. And by the way, of these 7 citations, 2012 and on, 4 of them are by Zelton. So when Zelton cites his own paper, he cites our correction, right? So you can't blame him. He's like the only person who's paying attention to a correction to his own paper. And he was very gentlemanly and through the entire process. You know, he had some quibbles with certain things we wrote and blah, 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 but he's like, oh my God, we made a mistake. This really changed some of our conclusions. So I always wonder if he had not been such a kind of gentleman and had been more thin-skinned about it, I don't know what would have happened. I think there's a good chance it never would have been published. Okay, where's the technical debt? Here. The problem with this is if you go to the Zelton paper like today and you want to read that paper, it says nothing about a correction, right? There's no way you would know on that website that a correction was published. However, if you go to PNAS, I don't know why the A is missing. My computer's been very fussy. If you go to PNAS and you want to read Don Anderson's paper about the inner core of the Earth in 2002, there's a little button that says this article has been corrected. And it turns out it was a very minor correction. It was like some photo credit wasn't given appropriately. But you can click on the link and go right to the correction. So PNAS has figured this out, how to make corrections easily accessible. The American Economic Review has not. So one thing I want to talk about, just a few more thoughts here, 2 more sections of this talk is so just some thoughts on institutions. So economists and maybe political scientists and sociology, I guess lots of people, including maybe law and psychology, should be able to help answer the question, whose fault is this and who should fix it and how much will it cost? Okay, so it's great to hold hands and kumbaya and said, open science, yay, we should all do more open science. But some people won't do it unless you force it upon them, or some people might find it really hard to do, or it may be that the technical debt is something that really has to be resolved by a journal website. Like I'm not gonna spam people saying, read my correction to Zelton's paper. That's just not the best method. So a lot of these movements sort of science are kind of a coordination problem. There's a famous example in Tom Schelling's book about micromotives and macro behavior about hockey helmets, where if none of the other players wore a hockey helmet, he claims, you wouldn't wear one because it cuts down your line of vision or something like that, even though it will help your safety. But if the league says everyone has to wear a hockey helmet, everyone's safer, right? So you don't lose the competitive advantage, but by being the one person with who is disadvantaged by wearing a helmet. So for example, if your institution says you need to practice open science in order to get tenure, that could be problematic because, what if it takes you a whole bunch of time to do this open science process and you don't get tenure and you go to somewhere else? So it's like, we think that open science is a bunch of bullshit. You shouldn't have wasted your time on that. You should have written one more paper. So it's kind of hard. I would much prefer multilateral standards imposed by professional societies, journals, and funders if they can be coordinated. And so here's just an example I thought was interesting. This is from the I4R. If you haven't heard of that, again, it's called Institute for Replicability. You can Google it and find it easily. It's Abel Brodeur, B-R-O-D-E-U-R. And so they just did some surveys where they asked journal editors in economics and political science. That was the main focus of Abel's interest. Do you publish comments in the journal? And by comment, I mean a paper that discusses and potentially challenges the empirical results from another paper without new data, let's say, for example, based on a reanalysis or additional robustness checks. So, like Kathy used to be an auditor, so it's like auditing in accounting. Like, I'm going to go look over your stuff and just check the math. And I may do some math you didn't do that will help me understand what's going on. And so the good news is they got a lot of responses. So this is the field of study, economics. This is the name of the journals. Some of these you will know, even if you're not close to economics. And most of them said, yes, we do publish comments. But it was never really straightforward, right? So the Economic Journal, Francesco Lippi says the board of editors recently discussed the issue, ... And John Duffy, who I know very well, said, your questions do not lend themselves to simple yes or no answers. Well, but if you click on read more, he says, a lot of times a paper will reproduce somebody's original result and then add like another treatment, or another thing they're interested in. And so we don't treat that as a pure replication, but we do, like we would like a paper that does that. And then Dirk Kruger at IER says, we don't have written rules or restrictions of what papers you publish. Now you can imagine if you're an early career researcher and you're trying to decide, should I do a replication and send it to IER, the journal is not helping you at all to make that decision. So I think those journals are just a bit irresponsible. Anything, if you have a bias in your journal one way or the other, just tell the editors about it. For example, there's a journal called Journal of Risk and Uncertainty that publishes papers about risk and uncertainty. And we sent a game show paper there and they said, oh, we don't publish game show data. I mean, first, I think that's stupid because game shows are really interesting. And often it's one of the few domains where people have very high financial stakes and you can kind of see what's going on. Sometimes literally from cameras, right? You might be able to encode facial emotions and things like that. But more importantly, the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty doesn't say in their statement of editorial focus, no game shows. So they wasted a bunch of our time. That's another piece of technical debt, right? Why don't you just have a list, like here's papers we just don't publish. Anyway, so I thought most of these, like, the fact that the editors responded is great, right? That's very, very good. You can imagine not getting good response. And most of them have said, yes, we do publish comments and they give little guidelines, but there's not much coordination, right? So if you're a young graduate student said, do economics journals like comments? Is it easy to publish a comment? Like, I don't know, I'd say go to this website and look, and it depends on what journal it is, right? So, and I should add, competition among journals is to some extent a pretty healthy thing, right? But it'd be nice if there's some standardization or at least clarity on a journal by journal basis about how to do it. Okay. So who has incentives and prestige? These are just off the top of my head thoughts. Many of you have thought about this much more carefully. And I'm really hoping that a sort of political economy paper comes along that sort of solves this problem of like, who can do this most cheaply and most effectively in a way that coordinates and creates good incentives, but doesn't penalize early career researchers particularly. It's like, oh, welcome to the profession. Since you don't have tenure, you have to practice open science. Me, you have tenure, I can get away with it. That's not good. So one is professional societies. I think generally they've been pretty good. Certainly, I know Psych Science, I think, responded, the various editors responded to a feeling that they were publishing a lot of cute false positives by being very, 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 very thoughtful what we should do. I saw some correspondence and discussions with people there. They spent a lot of mental energy thinking about this. Economics has been behind. For example, They require pre-registration of a randomized controlled trial. Like if you study, mosquito netting in Africa, you have to pre-register that. But they do not require it for economics lab experiments. And the reason, as far as I can tell, is some of it's status snobbery. They don't care about lab experiments as much. And some of it is the lab experiment people have been pretty hostile to pre-registration. Not me, but others. And they don't like being told what to do. How about journals, right? So the journals have mostly, in economics, I think it started 8 or 10 years ago, where they required instructions and raw data and sometimes code. A lot of that, I think, is spread to many, many areas. The problem is it just takes work for somebody to like run the code and check and see what happens. About 18 years ago, I was visiting Robert Moffat, who was the editor of American Economic Review at the time, and I said, "What's the hardest thing about your job as the editor of this highly prestigious journal?" And he said, "It's basically calling up people and saying, we're not going to publish your paper until you put all the code and the data in the repository." He said that I spend about 80% of my time calling people up and scolding them, because all the email they get from staff, they get email from some staff person and then from some person they recognize. And finally they get a phone call from Robert Moffat. It was like, "You give us your data or we won't publish your paper." So that just goes to show you that even the prestige of publishing an AER isn't enough to necessarily make people very briskly work to the rules. And some of the journals, I think, are just going to do not a great job. Like Nature Human Behavior switched to these reporting standards. It's this long piece of paper. It's really a mess. They also don't allow novelty claims. You can't say ours is the first paper to do X. And I think the reason is they know that people sometimes overclaim, and that's false, and they don't want to have to police it. So I don't think those are great practices, but different journals are trying things out. This is going to be a many years, like 1 or 2 decade progression until we get to a better situation. Funders, I think, as I said, they've been pretty eager, at least in our case, to fund large multi-scale studies just to get stuff out there, like, can replication be done? They want to get this idea that, there's no glamour. There is no glamour in publishing replication, but at least you can get it published, as you'll see in a minute. And as I mentioned before, ours have been published in Science, Nature Human Behavior, and the meta-analysis we did, one in Economic Journal, which was the very extremely well reviewed and only the second place we tried, and the other in Journal of Economic Literature, which was also a dream thing. So most places think if you're going to do this meta-analysis, it's a gargantuan amount of work. We're going to publish it without being too fussy. One thing you could do if I was running these agencies, I would hold back some money as a completion bonus, just like you might do with like an architect or somebody who's working on your house, right? It's like you're going to get a 20% bonus after I've gone through, Steve, and checked, your website. And if I make a list of like, you must finish these 9 things in a week, and you don't finish those 9 things, you don't get the last 20% of your money, which is how lots and lots of industries work. We could work that way too. The only thing I want to say about this is, again, Kathy and I were talking about this idea of auditing, is that this is going to be expensive, right? So what journals ideally should do is have a small staff. I know at the American Economic Review, each of the major editors will often have a grad students who then take code and data and reproduce everything. And it's kind of a training exercise. It's a good training exercise for grad students, right? They have to work their way around databases. They have to use some judgment about, oh my God, is this really a mistake or not? Maybe it's 1.02 and I got 0.98. So you can imagine talented undergrads or students in between college and doctoral programs, we call pre-docs or post-bacs. You can imagine them doing this pretty effectively, but they're just not free. And funding agencies can also audit compliance with open science, like, is your data posted somewhere? Is it on the NIH repository? But it just is going to take extra staff people. And I think to be realistic, we need to think about the price tag of this is like 10% of the cost of research. So if I was working on funding, I would think about a $200,000 grant. 20 grand should be budgeted for, say, data hygiene and repository compliance. And it would be some combination of, you know, somebody in your group. It could be a technical staff person, or it could be a good administrator, or it could be a student. And me and Aish, I'm going to call them up and have a few Zoom calls with them to make sure it really gets done. And you know, there are other things that could be tried. There are things that can be tried. I don't know the state of the art of how funders are thinking about this, and federal funding, or, you know, government funding and private funding like Sloan may work very differently. The private funders are much more nimble. They can try out different stuff. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is many analysts. So the first paper I know of, there may have been others at smaller scale, was the Zobrazon paper, where they gave data on penalty cards given to soccer players, football players of various races, and to see if there was a race bias. There's some earlier work on this in NBA refereeing about whether you know, black players in the NBA get more fouls called against them, and are they more fouls called by black referees and white referees, blah 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 blah. And so in that spirit, they had all these beautiful data from the beautiful game, from so-called football, un-American football, maybe we should call it football. And they had 61 groups, I think, take the same data, and they're basically told, test this hypothesis. Does race associated with penalties? And they got a fair amount of variation. Most of the groups, I think about a quarter of the group said not sure, zero effect. And most of them found a race effect, a race penalty, and then a few found the opposite. And it's a very, very important paper because they also have a lot of pages. It's 20 pages. So most of the paper goes through, is this too much variation? What should we do? Whose fault is it? Is it p-hacking? They had a lot of space, unlike some of the papers I'm going to show you in a minute. They had a lot of space to really work carefully through, why are we doing this and what are we learning? Anyway, there's 3 newer papers. And I just happened to read these very carefully because I was asked to write a comment on the Breslau paper. One is by a group of, including me and Nature. We had a large data set of 108 people's brains being scanned when they were making risky financial choices, a very classic neuroeconomics paradigm going back to work by Russ Poldrack and others. And we gave people 8 specific hypotheses, like, is amygdala encoding like smaller potential losses? When you see a pie on a screen, it says you could lose 8 or you could win 12. Is it encoding that loss of 8 in some way? And there were 8 different hypotheses coming from previous literature which said, just test these. And then we also had a prediction market where people could bet on whether the hypothesis test would pass or not by some, you know, corrected p less than 0.05. Breslau tested immigration and political support for government welfare. That one's a little different because they give them a whole bunch of data from OECD countries, how you define the amount of immigration and how you define political support. There's some wiggle room in how you can make choices. They let the teams decide what to do. And the third one is hopefully coming out in Journal of Finance. They had 18 years of trading data from the German stock exchange, and they asked people to analyze various financial market trends. They have 164 teams, right? So one lesson from this is you can get people to volunteer their labor to analyze these data if they don't have to collect the data themselves, right? And it's packaged for them, you know, just running some tests. You can get teams to participate in exchange for co-authorship on a giant list with quite a lot of enthusiasm. So who knew, you know, and also they have deadlines. It's like, if you don't get done in X months, you know, we're not going to include you. So like, hurry up. We're not going to wait for the slowest person. It would take forever. And later today, you're going to see one of these on EcoEvo, which sounds great. Okay, so here's a picture I made, a very action-packed picture in this comment I wrote, just summarizing some of what's going on. Let's start with Breslau. So this is the effect size of a positive effect means more immigration, means more, I think more support for government welfare, although I may have the sign wrong. In a way, it doesn't matter because you can see there's a lot of positives, a lot of negatives. And so the conclusions are are ordered from rejected to the null hypothesis of 0 is rejected to not testable. So some groups said, this is not testable with these data. That's an interesting category. And others said, yes, it's supported. So this negative is supported, which means the alternative hypothesis is a negative effect of immigration and welfare. More immigrants, we don't like giving money away. Okay, and you can see there's a lot of overlap, right? So some of the groups who said the hypothesis is rejected got negative effect sizes, and some said it was supported got negative effect sizes. And what this very complex graph on the bottom shows you is these are scores for various characteristics of what the different groups did. Okay, so remember, each of these diamonds on the top is one group's results. If you drop down, you can see whether that group had a high percentage of positive test results or not, whether they believe the hypothesis was true ex ante. They asked the investigators, do you think it's true? Are you in favor of immigration? How much do you know about this? How statistically skilled are you? Like, have you written, do you teach a methods course in your university? And then people scored the models like based on some score of like model quality. So the idea was to get into every single one of the 70 teams and try to score all the analytical decisions, right, as best you can. And the problem is, if you try to correlate any of these rows with the results, you just don't get strong correlations. So it's not the case, for example, that the people who are pro-immigrant, right, were more likely to find a positive effect. Or the people who believe the hypothesis was true were more likely to find a negative effect, which confirms there's just none of that stuff. It is just, it turns out they estimate that like 80% of the variation in conclusions cannot be explained by any of these analytical variations. So there's a lot of what I call like dark methods. Something is going on and they coded the heck out of it, right? So you might say, well, they probably left out some important variables. They did not leave out any important variables. They obviously left out some variables because there's this 80% mystery that's generating analytical variation, but they coded everything they could possibly think of. This is a graph of prediction market prices for the neuroscience paper by Butt and Vic-Nazer. This is hypothesis 8, which is loss encoded in amygdala. The percentage of groups that concluded the answer is yes was 5%. That's the answer, the correct answer. And this team was betting on what the percentage would be. The people who had less experience in blue were guessing 70%. People with more experience in green were guessing 25%. And then this is some results from the Megveld study. I don't have time to dig into that quite now since we're almost done. Okay. So I think the main finding there's a lot of cross variation. Most of the teams were asked how much variation will there be, and they were estimated way too little. Like the standard deviation of the effect size would be 5%, and it was like 25%. Except for a few hypotheses that are very, very narrow. So narrow, they're almost like counting, like what percentage of client volume, you know, it is, how much does client volume, not algorithmic trading, account for trade? It's like an arithmetic question. And there, they all got the same answer, and they estimated the variation correctly. So there are some exceptions where if you cast a hypothesis very, very, very narrowly, so there's not much room for getting a different answers, you won't get them. There is some good news. For example, in the soccer study, this was not true. In the financial trading study, they had several rounds, and so you could submit your analysis, and they had some like referees, like an appellate court or like a Supreme Court, that would read the analysis and say, I think this is high quality, this is low, and then they would show like the 5 best analysis to everybody else. So very much like you might do, like you might have rounds of iteration, like with a graduate student, you know, where you look at their analysis and you point out mistakes, or you should read these 3 papers that did a better job than you. So there was this like hyper peer review, and that actually reduced the variation a lot. But I think this is a big wake-up call, because it means if you're getting one of these analyses and you have to decide whether to publish it or not, you don't actually know what's driving the results in many of these cases, unless it's very, very narrowly focused. So if I was like editors of journals, like psych science did when there was this crisis about really serious poor replicability. You need to just get your groups together and figure out what to do. So in general, I'm very enthusiastic that stuff is getting done. The answer is not always the answers we would most want, right? So there's this hidden variability. That is not the answer we most want. We do not want that answer, but we're stuck with it. There's some variation, as I said, across, some of the hypotheses are very narrowly cast, and also in the FMI study, it turns out there's like a couple of major differences in how people did the work that accounted for most of the differences. It's literally kernel smoothing. The fMRI data is very noisy, and so usually you smooth the data, to kind of flatten it out. And if you have a wide smoothing kernel and a narrow one, you sometimes get different results. So sometimes there's an analytical technique which does make some clear difference. And I guess the main thing, just to remind you again, is who should pay for this auditing? Who should do it? How should it get accounted for? How do we accumulate regularity? Those are all things that are ongoing, being negotiated. Thanks, everyone.
That's great. All right, so we are almost at time, but Colin, if you can stay for 10 minutes or so, we can do.
Yeah.
Great, fantastic. All right. Okay, so
I'm in your hands on questioning, so I can see the chat and nothing else. Oh, you have audiences, right? So
if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we can see the other.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay. All right. So questions. Yeah, please. Yeah. So Colin, the question is, can you provide a little more information about how you coded the authors for the study, where you used AI? And, what was your theory behind that? What were you thinking when you were, thinking about seniority or mix of gender for authors? Why did you zero in on author mix?
Oh, okay. So, yeah, we didn't. I mean, the beauty of machine learning is you don't really have to have a well-motivated a priori hypothesis. You just put a ton of variables in there, and as long as you're guarding against overfitting, which is the big danger, in every stats class. There are various hypotheses. One theory is a lot of senior authors I know in some areas of social psych felt like there's a skill to replicating a paper, and if you're a grad student, you don't have the skill. Another view is senior investigators. I think this is somewhat true in some areas of economics. I don't think neuroscience so much, but another theory is that senior investigators can get away with shit. Like you can p-hack more, or you can publish more flamboyant results. Like in social psych, Daryl Bem published these results on precognition and parapsychology. And if his name wasn't Daryl Bem, that paper would probably not be published in JPSP. I don't know. Right. So in most of these cases, I think we just coded gender just because we were curious, and we thought, there's some evidence that men are more risk-taking. Most of the clear frauds that have taken place, like Dietrich Steppel and some others, are men. If you look at rogue traders who destroy Barings Bank, 100-year-old bank, or Jerome Keviel. I used to teach about this in my organizational economics and like organizational criminal economics course. They're all men, right? So it may be that men are more sloppy. I don't think the gender one, we put it on our list because we didn't want to like censor it out. I don't think male dominated teams are probably better at generating replicable results or not. It's just that sometimes, the sampling error, if the effect's even genuine, I don't know what the causal mechanism might look like. It might be that women are less likely to speak up. On the other hand, in a lot of cases, women are more likely to whistleblow than men. So when it comes to these extreme cases, who knows? And we're interested in senior, junior, because there's ideas about how that works. Maybe the juniors are very, very conscientious, and they get in trouble because their senior author is playing fast and loose. And we just coded stuff that we could get. We didn't want to have to hand code anything too qualitatively, so we just coded like what department they're in, what journal it's in, a few things like that.
Great. I have a question for you on what you call dark methods. I really like that label. So I've been thinking about dark methods in empirical legal studies. I've been working with a group to try to push all sorts of transparency and critical appraisal methods in empirical legal studies. And one thing that we're really facing resistance on is pre-registration for observational studies. There are all sorts of, I think not very persuasive reasons why they don't want to do pre-registration. Do you have any hope that pre-registration can solve the dark methods problem?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, the Bresnow study is the most demoralizing on this count. I think all the other studies, I haven't reread the original soccer study from 2018 that carefully, but they worked very hard to try to get people to write down like every single thing they did. And that's not observational data. It's like, here, Kathy, here's the OECD there, and here's a bunch of things from the World Value Survey about what government should do. So there's no design decisions in curating and producing data, as you might see like in anthropology. You go to some village and but I think it's really a matter of norms within the field and pride, and also how draconian the journals want to be. Like, I was very disappointed when the AEA said, we're not going to require lab experiments to be pre-registered, like you're off the hook, just because a bunch of people bitched and complained. And I think there's certain things that just have to be standardized, and there's a learning curve, right? So it's true that we're going through a period where people feel like, well, I pre-registered all this stuff, and then the referees didn't even go back and look at my pre-registration. But that we just need to build in like an auditing mentality into the system somehow, or maybe that, like a lot of the economics journals have a data editor who's like a faculty member who's really talented, who says, instead of publishing a bunch more papers, I'm going to use the blessings of tenure to do this important thing. And like, I'm not going to get famous. I'm not going to win some award. People are just going to get mad at me when I scold them. But if you just need enough people to step up and be willing to do those jobs, and then if money, money or prestige, hopefully will fill the bill.
Great. One more question. Anyone? Time for one more? Yeah.
Sorry, another detailed question about the random forest study. So with your random forest thing, where you got the labels and the factors. For example, you had the social psych and cognitive psych, and then you had the coefficients after the lasso method. So for example, the cognitive psych, the coefficient estimation, that's what we call what was estimated was 0, it looks like. So I'm having trouble understanding how to interpret that that factor, cognitive psych, was in most of the forest runs. But when you do the lasso stage, which I don't follow, I mean, you could say more about what it means if it ended up at 0, and how do I interpret that? That it mattered in most of the models, but it ended up at 0.
Yeah, I think I actually can't remember the details as well as I should in order to answer your question perfectly accurately. But my recollection was that when you run the lasso in order to get a coefficient number rather than an importance rating, right? Sometimes the lasso regularizes and sets the coefficient to 0. So even though it's in the random forests a lot, even some of those, like you mentioned, 30, 40, 50%, it's in a lot of random forest trees, it just gets a 0 coefficient. Often that's because there's just a lot of sampling error, or it may be that coefficient is correlated with something else. You know what I mean? Like, it may be in social psych, a lot of the effects are interactions, and in cognitive, it's not interactions. So the interaction variable is collinear with, say, cognitive psych, And one of the things Lasso does is if variables are highly collinear, because if you're penalizing coefficients for their value to try to avoid overfitting. So if you have two coefficients that are highly overlapping, it sometimes will just pick one. And so I think you can get these kind of weird mismatches. And again, this is we did machine learning because we had a lot of predictors and not that many replications. So we wanted to put a lot of stuff in. And I think Adam is very conscientious. And so I think if you go to our website, this was a byproduct of this giant, Adam and Outmade and others and Gideon Neve worked on the original science paper. And so this was like accumulation. And I think our open science practices were pretty good. I know I was at a conference at Berkeley at BITS, and somebody actually, I put up some website. I said, you can try to replicate this yourself. And suddenly said, yeah, I did it over the lunch break. It was like, so I am not conscientious. I wish I was, I'm just not, but I try to impress it upon other people, basically. Do as I say, not as I do. And I think that stuff is, if you want to go look at it again or rerun it in a methods class or something, our intent was to make it really, really easy to do.
Awesome. All right, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Colin.
Thanks, everyone. I will hope to come to your meeting sometime in the future.
All right, take care.
Thank you, floating, clapping hands.